I'm Warren Sprouse. This is the Bible Forum. We're here every Sunday night from 8 until 10 p.m. Eastern. We look at life through a biblical lens. We try to solve all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. And I think we have a problem today. It's called family. The family is in disarray. Leadership in the family is falling apart. It isn't really there anymore. In the main, in smaller venues, there are some really good families out there. Well, how do you teach a child to fear the Lord? I don't need to be afraid of Him, but to have a really holy respect for God. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." John MacArthur is a pastor out in California. He's been there forever. I saw him at a pastor's meeting in Philadelphia in 1977. It was February in Philadelphia, and it was an old church we met in. There must have been 200 pastors that showed up, and there was no heat in the building. Nobody went home. It was a good experience. But he's got a number of things that he has laid out that you can do to teach your children the fear of God. He says, teach your kids the attributes of God. You need to know who God is before you can begin to understand Him, so that you would have the proper respect. He says not only will they fear Him in a reverential way, but they'll also fear sinning against Him. And that'll keep your children, or at least help them, to recognize that God is worthy of honor and respect. In order to teach this properly, the parents must fear God themselves. If we don't teach our children to fear God, the devil will teach them to reject and hate God. He says we need to teach our children to guard their minds. Proverbs chapter 3, "Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck. Write them upon the table of your heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man." The word heart here refers to the mind. The mind is the seat of thought, emotion, will. And this passage is calling parents to teach their children to guard their minds. As a father, you are the guardian of your child's mind. Your duty is to protect them from the world, but it doesn't stop there. You must also do your best to fill their minds with truth and with kindness and ultimately with God's Word. We are told to keep, to guard, to protect our hearts. And we just need to tell them, teach them to keep and to guard and to protect their heart. The heart, which is the seat of all decision making. For out of it, the Bible says, are the issues of life. You don't teach your children to guard their heart, the devil will gladly teach them to have an open mind about all sorts of things. Teach your children to obey their parents. The Proverbs are filled with statements like this. "A wise son heareth his father's instruction, but a scorner heareth not rebuke." The writer of Proverbs is reinforcing the first commandment with a promise, namely to honor your father and your mother, Ephesians 6:2. MacArthur goes on to say that when your children learn to obey you, they'll be better equipped to learn how to obey societal authority, and more importantly, how to obey God. A child who is taught to obey will be a child who learns self-control and true wisdom. And if we don't teach our children to obey their mother and their father, the devil will teach them to rebel and to break our hearts. Teach your children to select their companions carefully, wisely. You can't sit back and wait and see how your children are going to turn out, what friends they will naturally gravitate toward. You need to teach them how to choose their friends. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that evil communications, that is relationships, fellowships, corrupt good manners, that is their morals. The friends our children hang out with will have a direct influence on who they will become. And that's why we go on the attack, helping them choose the right kinds of friends. Now, the other side is at work as well. You can tell a person by the friendship they keep. Proverbs chapter 1 says, "My son, if sinners entice you, consent not." It's easy for children to get wrapped up in other people because of sports or art or whatever, or just dating, little things that kids do in school and things of that nature. We need to equip them with wisdom so that they will develop the discernment to be able to choose friends wisely. And if you don't teach your children how to do that, the devil will gladly choose their companions for them. He says, teach your children to control their body. A dominant theme throughout the early chapters of Proverbs is the topic of controlling our bodies. In Proverbs 2, we are warned, and Solomon says that only wisdom will deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words, that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. The parent warns his children of people who will seek adultery, knowing that the consequences of adultery are devastating. As extreme as death might sound, that's the warning that God gives it. And it's not necessarily that their bodies are going to die, but there will be a kind of death, a spiritual death, an emotional death, all sorts of things. Sex is addictive. It will dominate your soul if you're not careful. Teach your children sexual purity, to keep their hands to themselves, to stay away from temptation, to guard their eyes. We're talking TV here. We're talking internet. We're talking texting, tweeting, just pictures that are transferred onto phones. If you don't teach your children to control their bodies, the devil will teach them to give their bodies over to lust. It's natural. He says, teach your children to enjoy their spouse, the one they're married to. Sex outside of marriage is obviously forbidden, but inside marriage, it's exalted. Proverbs says, drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind in pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. In other words, a man or a woman who is sexually thirsty is going to look for satisfaction. He needs to look at his own, her own spouse. The way we treat our spouse will be a great way to teach our children to be satisfied in their spouse. If we don't teach our children to enjoy the marriage partner given them by God, the devil will teach them how to destroy their marriage through adultery. Today, the growing tendency is to find gratification artificially in pornography, and now we have virtual sex. There's a lot more that we need to do in this area with our children. Teach your children to watch their words. Proverbs 4 says, put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Got to teach our children to speak the truth and only the truth. MacArthur provides some great questions for our children to ask before they speak. For example, is what I'm about to say edifying? Is it appropriate? Is it gracious? Is this the time? Our speech as Christians must be uplifting, instructive, helpful. If we don't teach our children to watch their words, the devil will fill their mouth with gossip, slander, lies, and foul language. Are you seeing a pattern here? If you don't teach your children, the devil will. Teach your children to work hard by both word and example. Proverbs 6, the father tells his son, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. They do it by instinct. We must teach our children to work hard even when there is no supervisor. Self-motivation is the key to success in this life, and planning ahead is part of it. The father in Proverbs also warns against being a sluggard, one who gives excuses for not working and always procrastinates when it's time to work. Don't let them do that. The consequences for the lazy person are hunger, poverty, and failure. If you don't teach your children to work hard, the devil will teach them to be lazy, which will impoverish them. Teach your children to manage their money well. Money plays a very large part in everyone's life, and that's why Proverbs speaks so often about it and how we manage it. If we're careful with our money, it can be very useful. But if we're careless, money can become the source of a great deal of anxiety and heartache. MacArthur goes on to provide 2 lessons from the book of Proverbs about money. The first one is to be generous with God. Proverbs 3:9. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce, so that your barns will be filled and plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. Our money does not belong to us. It is God's. He allowed us to get it, and we must teach that to our children. Our kids will know if we're generous with our money, and if so, they will follow that example. Secondly, Proverbs warns us not to co-sign with a stranger. We're not to become liable for another person's behavior, somebody that we don't really know that well and we can't control. And it includes get-rich-quick schemes and other businesses that can have serious consequences if done in partnership with untrustworthy people. We must then teach our children to use their money as the Lord leads. If we don't teach our children how to manage their money properly, the devil will teach them to spend it carelessly and to go into debt. Teach your children to love their neighbor. Proverbs warns against partnering with untrustworthy people, but it doesn't say that we should be generous to those but it does say that we are to be generous to those in need. Proverbs 3 says, withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. Say not unto thy neighbor, go and come again, and tomorrow, and I will give you when thou hast it. If we have it, we should help people. In order to honor God, we must be generous in showing sacrificial love to our neighbor. Jesus included loving your neighbor as one of the 2 greatest commandments. And so we too must not only teach our children to love God, but also to teach them to love their neighbor. If we don't teach that, the devil will gladly teach them to love only themselves. These things are just the tip of the iceberg. But there are some words of reminder. First, ultimately, God is the one who will save our children. Even the best parents have experienced heartbreak with their children. Secondly, our children learn a lot more from our example than from what we teach them verbally. We need to take what we've learned from Proverbs, strive to live it out in our own lives, and faithfully teach it to our children, praying that God will make it fruitful in their lives for His glory. Your grandchildren are at stake. The society is at stake. The nation is at stake.